The frost clinging to the iron-wrought window panes of Thornmere Keep was thick, jagged, and unrelenting. It crawled across the glass like the sprawling icy fingers of a forgotten god, sealing the massive royal bedchamber in a suffocating, freezing silence. But that external, biting winter cold could not rival the deep, terminal chill currently settling into the very marrow of Seren Vantrell's bones. She stood completely motionless in the exact center of the dim, cavernous room, her calloused hands resting lightly upon the heavy, midnight fabric of a black wool cloak. The stones beneath her thin shoes seemed to pulse with the ancient, hostile energy of the keep, a fortress that had never truly welcomed her. It was a monument to war, built by ruthless alpha kings who valued power over warmth and strategy over soul. The cloak was a massive, imposing garment, woven strictly for a man whose sheer physical presence alone commanded the immediate, terrifying submission of 10,000 wolves, Draven Blackwood, the Alpha King of Thornmere. Under normal circumstances, the heavy wool smelled purely of him. Bitter winter pine, weathered battle leather, the crisp ozone of the northern snow, and the metallic tang of the southern mountain winds. It was a sharp, inherently masculine scent that triggered a deep, biological instinct of safety and reverence within the pack. A scent that, by all the sacred laws of the ancestors, was supposed to mean home to her. But tonight, beneath those sharp elemental layers, lay a much softer, far more insidious note. It was a sweet, cloying fragrance that did not belong anywhere near the sovereign's sacred armor. It was an artificial, suffocating scent of blooming flowers in the dead of winter, gardenia perfume. It clung to the wool collar like a parasite, woven into the very fibers of his mantle. Seren did not gasp. She did not hurl the heavy wool across the freezing stone floor in a sudden fit of melodramatic rage. Nor did she collapse into a weeping, pathetic heap of shattered delusions. She simply lowered her eyelashes as the sickeningly sweet scent of the floral oil coated the back of her throat, thick and poisonous. It was the exact perfume her glamorous older sister, Genevieve Vantrell, imported at great expense from the distant eastern trading ports, a rare, highly concentrated oil that clung to skin, breath, and heavy fabric with a stubborn, suffocating grip. Seren stood perfectly still, letting the heavy, oppressive silence of the massive royal keep press against her eardrums, listening only to the steady, entirely unbroken rhythm of her own breathing. A sudden, vicious pulse of heat flared violently against the skin of her right hip. The crescent claiming mark, bound into her spirit on the night of their mating ceremony, throbbed with a phantom, searing agony. This was the true, unforgiving biological cruelty of the fated mate bond. It was not merely a spiritual metaphor sung by bards, nor was it a romantic, abstract ideal written into ancient pack lore. It was a living, breathing, absolute tether connecting two souls across space and time, and when one half of that sacred bond strayed, the other half absorbed the devastating physiological shock. Every single time the Alpha allowed another woman into his bed, the dormant ancient magic within Seren's blood recognized the severe betrayal, lashing her nervous system with microscopic needles of frost and burning fire. She pressed the heel of her palm hard against the burning mark, forcing the physical pain down into the hollow, dead space where her foolish hope used to reside. Carefully, meticulously, she folded the black wool cloak. She smoothed the dark fabric with palms that had spent years scrubbing wooden tavern floors and tending to muddy herbal gardens before the sovereign ruler had arbitrarily elevated her to the position of Luna. Draven had needed a swift political alliance with her fallen, ancient bloodline to quiet a massive rebellion in the lower territories. He had needed her strategic, royal signature on a treaty of peace to stabilize the restless borders. He had never needed her heart, and he had certainly never asked for her soul. Placing the perfectly folded garment at the foot of the massive, imposing four-poster bed, Seren turned her back on it and walked toward the small, scarred wooden desk tucked away in the darkest corner of the royal chambers. She opened the heavy top drawer and withdrew a small, worn, leather-bound ledger. It was an unimpressive, fragile thing, entirely devoid of royal crests, golden clasps, or silver filigree, but it was the only object in this massive, freezing fortress that truly, undeniably belonged to her. She unstoppered a small glass vial of deep black ink, dipped the sharp point of her quill into the dark liquid, and flipped the heavy parchment pages to the last marked section. The paper was heavily lined with neat, precise, vertical slashes. She brought the metal nib to the paper and drew one more unwavering line, crossing a group of 4 to make a complete set. 66 calculated wounds delivered to the very soul of a woman who had never asked to wear a crown. She stared down at the fresh, wet ink, gleaming softly in the dim, flickering candlelight. 66 separate, undeniable instances of her sister's sweet gardenia scent clinging to her fated mate's clothing, his skin, his hair. 66 times she had felt the claiming mark burn like molten gold against her hip, twisting her blood into a toxic, feverish ache while the monarch spent his nights in another, far more luxurious wing of the keep. The agony of the first dozen had nearly driven her to her knees, leaving her gasping for breath on the freezing floor while the bond demanded an intimacy she was denied. She traced the feather of the quill with a steady thumb, her mind drifting back to the very first tally mark at the top of the page. It had been inked 2 agonizing years ago on the sacred night of the winter solstice. That night was supposed to be the beautiful celebration of their eternal union before the ancestors, the precise moment the fated bond settled into a permanent, glowing warmth. Instead, it became the moment Seren Vantrell's entire world shattered. She had caught the floral scent on Draven's ceremonial collar that evening, freshly applied and undeniably bold, screaming of intimacy. She had desperately tried to convince herself it was a simple mistake, a lingering trace from a passing embrace in the crowded banquet hall. But the agonizing, twisting heat in her hip had told her the absolute biological truth. Since that terrible night, she had documented every single transgression with chilling, mathematical precision. The second mark had been inked after a hunting trip, the 5th after a war council, the 20th after a moonlit patrol. She did not weep for the devoted, protective husband she was slowly losing, because she realized with brutal clarity that she had never truly possessed him to begin with. She did not beg the moon goddess for a miraculous mercy that would never come. She simply recorded the truth, letting the cold reality harden the last fragile, foolish pieces of her heart into an unbreakable diamond of pure, absolute resolve. The numbers were irrefutable. They represented the exact cost of her silence, the physical and emotional tax levied upon her very soul by a man who considered her nothing more than a convenient political asset. The Thornmere pack mistook her perpetual quietness for inherent weakness. The elite lords and ladies of the court openly whispered behind their jeweled goblets that the new Luna was a defective, submissive little Omega, entirely too broken and timid to command the respect of her terrifying, towering mate. They assumed she quietly tolerated his blatant indiscretions because she was desperate to keep her heavy silver crown, terrified of being cast back out into the impoverished, freezing wilderness. They did not understand that her silence was not a gesture of surrender. It was a highly organized, deeply calculated mechanism of pure, unadulterated survival. Every time the heavy gardenia scent invaded her sanctuary, she measured the remaining strength of her own soul, waiting patiently for the precise moment when the balance of her internal ledger would finally tip into the absolute negative. Tonight, the ledger was completely full. The mathematical equation of her quiet suffering had finally reached its undeniable, terminal conclusion. The burning in her hip was no longer a spike of acute, panic-inducing pain. It had slowly settled into a deep necrotic throb, signaling that the magical tether between them was actively decaying from the inside out. The bond was starving to death, poisoned by a constant, daily diet of neglect, humiliation, and infidelity, She closed the leather cover of the book with a soft, final thud that echoed in the quiet room. There would be no 67th mark. The counting was officially, permanently over. She had given him every possible chance to turn back, to choose the sacred mate bond over his temporary artificial desires. But he had chosen the rot, and now she would deliver the consequences. The massive timber portal at the far end of the bedchamber suddenly creaked open, abruptly shattering the monastic, heavy silence of the room. The thick iron hinges groaned in loud protest against the winter draught, but the bitter wind was instantly overwhelmed by a suffocating, invisible cloud. The cloying, heavy scent of sweet gardenia rolled heavily across the stone floor, flooding the room and instantly overpowering the natural, comforting smell of wood smoke and old parchment. The invasive aroma carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken insults, an arrogant declaration of dominance from a woman who wore her treachery like a jewel. Genevieve Vantrell stepped across the threshold. The glamorous older sister did not bother to knock, nor did she wait to be formally acknowledged by the reigning Luna of the pack. She moved with the confident, languid grace of a woman who firmly believed she owned the very stone beneath her feet, despite possessing no formal title or crown. She wore a gown of exquisite, deeply dyed crimson silk that clung perfectly to her curves, a stark, vibrant, and entirely inappropriate contrast to the dreary, oppressive grey of the keep's defensive architecture. Her dark hair was perfectly, intricately coiffed, her lips painted the exact terrifying colour of freshly spilled blood. She looked every inch the wealthy, untouchable sovereign, entirely comfortable and supremely arrogant, intruding upon the private, sacred chambers of the alpha pair. She paused to inspect a tapestry near the entrance, her expression one of utter boredom, as if she were touring a dusty museum rather than invading her sister's sanctuary. "Folding laundry, sister?" Genevieve's voice dripped with honeyed, theatrical condescension. She paused near the hearth, extending a pair of flawless, manicured hands toward the crackling flames, her ruby rings catching the light. "I would have sent one of the lower maids up to handle such menial, exhausting tasks. You are the Luna of Thornmere, after all, even if you rarely ever act like one." The quiet woman standing at the desk did not flinch. Seren did not turn her head to acknowledge the blatant insult, nor did she let a single ounce of the searing pain radiating from her branded hip show on her stoic features. She calmly wiped the wet nib of her quill on a scrap of linen, her movement steady, fluid, and entirely unhurried. A girl who has never been seen cannot be replaced, because she was never there to begin with. The thought anchored her mind, wrapping her frayed, burning nerves in a protective, numbing layer of elemental ice. Genevieve was not truly stealing the Alpha King. She was merely occupying a hollow, purely transactional space he had reserved for his own selfish, towering arrogance. "The maids are busy preparing the lower halls for the delegates," Seren replied flatly. Her voice was a soft, steady murmur, completely devoid of any trembling emotion, jealousy, or hidden rage. "I prefer to manage his personal garments myself. It ensures nothing of value is lost." Genevieve offered a sweet, entirely venomous smile, her dark eyes flashing wickedly in the firelight. "How terribly domestic of you, Seren. I suppose we all must find ways to make ourselves useful when we completely lack the natural authority to hold a king's attention. He works so incredibly hard to keep this dangerous territory safe. He requires a certain level of sophisticated distraction to unwind. Something a bit more refined than silent, boring obedience. But do carry on with your little chores. I'm sure he appreciates having his capes kept free of dust, even if he prefers to strip them off the moment he crosses my threshold." Before a response could be formed, the atmospheric pressure in the massive bedchamber plummeted sharply, stealing the breath from their lungs. The dancing flames in the stone hearth flickered violently and dimmed, leaning sharply away from the open doorway as an icy, biting draught swept relentlessly across the floorboards. The sheer, overwhelming weight of an apex predator instantly filled the room, pressing down like physical lead on the shoulders of everyone present. The very shadows seemed to elongate and bow in submission to the approaching entity. Draven Blackwood stepped through the imposing timber frame. His massive physical frame seemed to literally absorb the ambient candlelight, casting a long, terrifying shadow that swallowed the entire corner of the room. He was clad in dark, functional riding leathers, his broad, imposing shoulders dusted with fresh, melting snow from the outer courtyards. His thunderous gaze projected an absolute, unfeeling authority, scanning the chamber with the cold, clinical detachment of a ruthless warlord surveying a conquered battlefield. The crescent-claiming mark on Seren's hip flared into a sudden, blinding heat, a cruel, involuntary biological response to his overwhelming physical proximity. Her pulse raced, her skin flushing with a phantom fever, even as her heart remained firmly encased in a solid block of defensive frost. The towering alpha did not look at his fated mate. His imposing, terrifying gaze bypassed the small desk entirely, landing instead on the crimson-clad figure standing gracefully by the fire. For a fraction of a second, the harsh, unforgiving lines of his jaw softened. A subtle, almost imperceptible relaxation of his broad shoulders occurred, a quiet, devastating physical acknowledgement of the woman who shared his secret, stolen hours. It was a micro-expression of warmth that Draven had never, not even on their sacred mating night, directed toward his actual wife. The silent exchange spoke volumes, a private language of shared intimacy that deliberately excluded the quiet Luna standing just feet away. The Alpha King finally snapped his gaze back to a hard, clinical line as he addressed the woman sitting quietly in the shadows. He did not cross the vast room to greet her. He did not extend a hand to offer the basic, instinctual comfort that an Alpha owed his Luna. He did not ask how she fared in the bitter, unnatural cold that seemed to seep through the very foundation of the keep. He stood firmly in the doorway, a towering monument of emotional distance and impenetrable stone, and delivered his commands with the sharp, rhythmic cadence of a military general issuing orders to a lowly foot soldier. "The Border Council meets at first light," the imposing man stated, his deep voice rumbling through the heavy floorboards and vibrating against the soles of Seren's simple shoes. "Have my formal ceremonial garments prepared and laid out before the bells ring, and ensure the evening feast is properly managed in the main hall. We host the northern delegates tomorrow night, and I will not tolerate any logistical failures from the household staff. You will sit at my right side, and you will remain completely silent, unless directly addressed by the visiting elders." He offered no apology for his extended absence. He provided no fragile, stumbling excuse for the overwhelming scent of gardenia that practically radiated from his skin and hair. He expected her to simply accept this profound, repetitive humiliation as the standard, unspoken price of her heavy silver crown. He truly believed that because she had never raised her voice, never thrown a heavy goblet at his head in a jealous rage, and never begged for his affection, she was entirely content with being an invisible, convenient accessory to his expanding empire. Seren looked at the formidable man who was biologically destined to be her other half, her sworn sanctuary in a world full of teeth, claws, and violence. The ancient magic humming beneath her skin whispered of his immense, terrifying power, but it offered her absolutely zero shelter. She felt the exact, quiet moment her immense oceanic patience finally evaporated into nothingness. It was not a loud, fiery explosion of righteous rage. It was a cold, terminal click deep inside her chest. It was the heavy sound of an iron vault door swinging shut and locking forever. The math was done. The devastating debt was finally tallied. The fated bond was completely, irreparably bankrupt. "It will be done, Alpha," Seren replied. Her voice was smooth, flat, and completely steady. It was the voice of a ghost, a polite, hollow echo entirely devoid of any living warmth or lingering attachment. The imposing man nodded once, accepting her flawless obedience as his absolute, unquestionable right. He turned on his heel without another word, gesturing sharply for Genevieve in the crimson gown to follow him out into the winding stone corridor. The heavy door clicked shut behind them, sealing the thick, suffocating silence back into the cold room. Draven walked away firmly believing he had successfully broken his silent mate into a state of perfect, permanent compliance. He was entirely, devastatingly wrong. As the heavy footsteps of the Alpha King faded down the corridor, Seren stepped away from the desk and walked silently toward the hearth. She knelt on the cold stone, her fingers reaching into a hidden crevice beneath the floorboards to retrieve a long, narrow bundle wrapped in dark velvet. Unfolding the cloth, the firelight caught the gleaming edge of an ancient silver leaf dagger, its pure metal laced with the deadly, numbing essence of nightshade. This was not a weapon meant for flesh and blood, but a sacred instrument designed to sever the invisible threads of fate. She traced the freezing, flawless steel with her thumb, feeling the latent, dormant power of the lunar severing ritual humming beneath the surface. She slipped her heavy Moonstone Alliance ring from her finger, the silver band suddenly feeling foreign and cold, and placed it carefully on the stone hearth. The flames crackled and rose, reflecting in her steady storm-grey eyes, no longer a symbol of domestic warmth, but the waiting, absolute fire that would soon dissolve the claiming mark from her spirit, sever the magical anchor binding them together, and erase him from her soul completely. The descent into the forgotten underbelly of Thornmere Keep was a journey measured in absolute, suffocating darkness, and the steady, rhythmic clicking of Seren's thin shoes against ancient granite. She carried the velvet-wrapped silver-leaf dagger in one hand and a single, flickering tallow candle in the other. The winding, narrow spiral staircase plunged deep beneath the polished, opulent floors of the royal residence, bypassing the bustling kitchens, the heavily guarded armories, and the vast, echoing banquet halls, where the pack was currently sleeping off their winter solstice celebrations. Down here, the air grew incredibly dense. It smelled of damp earth, centuries of trapped moisture, and the faint metallic tang of dormant magic. The modern warlords of the Blackwood bloodline had long ago abandoned these subterranean depths, preferring to build their towering monuments of military strength closer to the sky. They had entirely forgotten that the true foundation of their empire was rooted in the ancient, sacred lunar magic they now openly despised. Seren reached the bottom of the stairs, stepping out into a cavernous, circular chamber that had once served as a primary temple for the moon goddess before the violent pack wars had outlawed such worship. The floor was covered in a thick, undisturbed layer of grey dust, perfectly preserving the intricate, overlapping geometric runes carved into the bedrock. The temperature down here was brutally, unforgivingly cold, a bone-deep chill that completely bypassed her simple woolen dress and settled directly into her joints. Yet the quiet woman did not shiver. The frozen environment perfectly mirrored the desolate, icy wasteland that now comprised her internal emotional landscape. She walked to the exact center of the forgotten temple, setting her candle down upon a low, flat altar of black basalt. She unfolded the dark velvet cloth, revealing the ancient dagger. The pure silver blade seemed to catch the meager candlelight and amplify it, glowing with a faint spectral luminescence. The metal was beautifully, terrifyingly sharp, laced with the dark, numbing essence of wild nightshade that had been folded into the steel during its forging. It was an artifact passed down through the hidden matriarchs of her fallen bloodline, a tool specifically designed for the unthinkable. To prepare the lunar severing ritual, she needed more than just the sacred blade. Reaching into the deep pockets of her apron, Seren withdrew a small, heavy iron mortar and a smooth stone pestle. She placed them carefully on the basalt altar beside the glowing knife. Next came a small leather pouch containing dried, toxic nightshade leaves, gathered in secret from the darkest edges of the pack's protective border walls, and a small glass vial filled with snow water that had been purified beneath a full moon. Her movements were practiced, highly organized, and completely devoid of any frantic, emotional hesitation. As she poured the brittle, dark leaves into the iron bowl, the crescent-claiming mark on her right hip suddenly flared with a violent, searing heat. It was a brutal, panicked throb, entirely different from the toxic ache of Draven's infidelity. The quasi-sentient magic of the fated mate bond recognized the immediate, lethal threat she was assembling. It began to fight back, desperately flooding her nervous system with a wave of intense, unearned longing. The phantom scent of bitter winter pine and weathered battle leather tried to force its way into her sinuses, a biological defense mechanism designed to make her drop the tools and run back to the royal bedchamber in blind, instinctual submission. Seren gripped the edges of the black altar, her knuckles turning stark white as the molten gold agony radiating from her hip threatened to buckle her knees. She squeezed her eyelids shut, forcing herself to breathe through the overwhelming artificial wave of pack devotion. She did not whine for relief. She did not bargain with the oppressive magic. She simply recalled the sickening, cloying scent of Genevieve's sweet gardenia perfume, letting that toxic memory act as an absolute impenetrable shield against the bond's desperate manipulation. The searing heat in her flesh eventually receded back into a dull, manageable burn, realizing it could no longer control her mind. Taking up the heavy stone pestle, she began to grind the dried leaves. The rhythmic, grating sound of stone crushing iron echoed loudly in the silent, cavernous room. Scrape, crush, scrape. As she worked, her mind drifted back to the frail, quiet woman who had originally taught her this forbidden herbal alchemy. Her grandmother had been one of the last true lunar priestesses, a woman who understood that true power was rarely loud, arrogant, or wrapped in heavy wolf fur. We are small things in a world of teeth, my Seren. Smallness is a gift. Use it. The old woman's voice echoed clearly in her memory, a ghostly whisper mixing with the grinding of the mortar. The elite lords of Thornmere had always looked right past the quiet, unassuming Omega. They had deemed her invisible, entirely irrelevant to their grand political schemes, viewing her simply as a convenient, submissive vessel to secure a treaty. Their towering arrogance had been their ultimate undoing. Her smallness, her absolute invisibility within the sprawling keep, was the exact gift that had allowed her to smuggle these forbidden, highly restricted magical components right under the noses of the sovereign's elite guard. She poured a few measured drops of the purified snow water into the crushed nightshade, stirring the mixture until it formed a thick, vibrant purple paste. The concoction emitted a sharp, incredibly bitter odor that stung her eyes, a clear warning of its highly toxic nature. It was a potent, topical poison, designed to temporarily kill the physical nerve endings in the flesh, so the body could survive the unimaginable spiritual trauma of what the silver blade was about to do. Seren unfastened the simple wooden buttons at the side of her dress, letting the heavy woolen fabric pool around her waist. The freezing cellar air bit aggressively at her exposed skin, but she ignored the physical discomfort. She looked down at her right hip. The crescent-claiming brand was raised, angry and glowing with a faint, feverish red light. It looked like an infected, rotting wound, a perfect physical manifestation of her completely bankrupt marriage. Taking a deep, steadying breath, she dipped 2 fingers into the iron mortar and scooped out a thick dollop of the purple paste. She smeared the freezing, toxic concoction directly over the angry brand. The physical reaction was instantaneous. A shocking, icy numbness rapidly spread outward from the center of the crescent, freezing her skin and entirely silencing the burning, localized pain. However, beneath the surface layer of deadened flesh, deep within the marrow of her bones, the magical root of the fated bond began to thrash violently, sensing its impending execution. She picked up the silver leaf dagger. The hilt was freezing against her palm, grounding her in the absolute reality of this terminal decision. The ancient texts her grandmother had forced her to memorize flared in her mind, a clear, undeniable warning of the physiological cost she was about to pay. The hollow mark doesn't just contain your power, it creates a void, an absence where your magic should be. By cutting this biological anchor out of her soul, she would permanently erase her status as a fated mate, leaving a dead, empty space in the fabric of her spirit. To the outside world, to the arrogant wolves who valued only physical dominance, she would appear entirely wolfless, completely broken and devoid of pack magic. They would never understand that this violent eviction was the only way to finally give her own suppressed, dormant lunar lineage the room it needed to breathe. Seren pressed the needle-sharp tip of the pure silver blade into her numbed skin, positioning it exactly a millimeter outside the raised, glowing edge of the crescent line. She did not allow her hand to tremble. She did not allow a single tear of regret to fall. She dragged the blade downward in a brutal, flawless semicircle. The physical pain was entirely muted by the nightshade, but the spiritual agony was instantaneous and absolute. It felt as though a massive, jagged hook had been buried deep inside her ribcage and was now being violently, mercilessly ripped out through her chest. The sound of 1,000 glass mirrors, shattering simultaneously, echoed inside her skull, a deafening, cosmic breaking that stole the breath from her lungs. The silver edge of the knife hissed loudly as it interacted with the ancient pack magic, sending off tiny, blinding sparks of white light that illuminated the dark cellar in brief, chaotic flashes. Blood welled up immediately, a stark, brilliant crimson against her pale skin, but it was accompanied by a thick, glowing golden ether, the physical manifestation of the shattered fated bond, bleeding out of her spirit. She gritted her teeth, a low, guttural sound of immense effort escaping her throat as she guided the dagger up the other side, completing the terrible, liberating circle. With a final, sickening pop of magical resistance, the brand was completely detached. Seren dropped the bloodied silver knife onto the basalt altar. It clattered loudly against the stone, the noise echoing sharply in the sudden, magnificent silence that followed. She pressed a thick pad of clean, folded linen against the open, weeping wound on her hip, leaning heavily against the black stone as the adrenaline slowly drained from her system. The searing, toxic heat that had plagued her body for 2 agonizing years was completely gone. The oppressive, heavy weight of the Alpha's dominance, the constant, phantom pressure in the back of her mind, demanding her quiet obedience, had vanished without a single trace. She took a deep, shuddering breath, filling her lungs to their absolute maximum capacity for the first time since her wedding night. She felt profoundly empty, undeniably scarred, and completely, beautifully free. Miles away, in the lavishly appointed, heavily fortified eastern wing of the Grand Keep, the atmosphere was a stark, entirely different world. The massive, cavernous war room was brilliantly illuminated by dozens of roaring hearths and hundreds of thick beeswax candles. The air was thick with the scent of roasted venison, expensive spiced wine, and the heavy, intoxicating aroma of absolute, unchallenged military superiority. Draven Blackwood stood firmly at the head of a massive, intricately carved oak tactical table, surrounded by his most trusted generals and the visiting northern delegates. He was a towering monument of physical perfection and lethal authority. He had just returned from Genevieve's warm, highly perfumed chambers, his body relaxed, and his supreme arrogance entirely validated by her desperate fawning attention. He felt invincible, an untouchable god among lesser beasts, currently pointing a thick, collused finger at a sprawling parchment map of the western borders, confidently dictating the precise movements of his vast, unstoppable armies. He was in the middle of issuing a harsh, unyielding command regarding a supply route when the universe abruptly, violently tore him in half. There was absolutely zero warning, no gradual onset of illness, no subtle fading of his immense strength, no preliminary twinge of discomfort to alert his highly trained predatory instincts. It was a catastrophic, instantaneous cosmic amputation. The towering sovereign suddenly stopped speaking mid-sentence, his broad, imposing shoulders locked completely rigid, his massive hands gripping the edges of the solid timber table, so hard the thick wood visibly splintered and cracked under his immense pressure. His metallic gaze, usually so cold, calculating, and full of absolute certainty, widened into massive, dilated pools of sudden, blind, unadulterated terror. A horrific, agonizing, tearing sensation ripped vertically through the very center of his chest, bypassing muscle and bone entirely to shred the deepest, most vital core of his soul. It felt as though a massive, invisible razor wire had been wrapped tightly around his spirit and suddenly, violently yanked backward by a vengeful deity. "My king?" one of the older, battle-scarred generals asked, stepping forward with a deep frown of genuine confusion. The elite warrior reached out a tentative hand, entirely unaccustomed to seeing the supreme commander of Thornmere show even a fraction of hesitation. Draven could not answer. The air in his lungs had spontaneously turned into freezing, solid lead. He staggered backward, his heavy riding boots scraping loudly against the polished stone floor. The devastating, catastrophic shockwave of the severed fated bond crashed into his nervous system, immediately shutting down his advanced physiological defenses. The color drained from his face in a single heartbeat, leaving his naturally tanned skin a sickly, ashen gray. He reached a desperate, trembling hand up to claw at the center of his chest, his thick fingers tearing right through the fine fabric of his dark riding leathers, as if trying to physically grab hold of a vital organ that was actively dissolving into ash. His inner wolf, the terrifying, colossal apexed predator that commanded absolute submission from 10,000 lesser shifters, let out a sudden, pathetic, terminal whine inside his mind. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated devastation. The beast was thrashing wildly in the dark, going completely feral as it scrambled to locate the warm, glowing tether of its mate, the sacred, biological anchor that kept the immense power of the Alpha grounded and stable. But there was nothing there. The tether was not merely damaged or faded by distance. It had been completely, surgically eradicated from the very fabric of reality. The void left behind was a freezing, dead vacuum that instantly began to suffocate the dying beast. Draven's massive legs buckled entirely. The supreme ruler of Thornmere collapsed heavily to the floor, shattering a thick wooden chair beneath his immense weight. The resounding crash echoed violently over the sudden, panicked shouting of the assembled military council. Several generals dropped to their knees beside him, their voices a distorted, chaotic blur of frantic concern that Draven could not comprehend over the deafening, roaring agony in his skull. A violent, involuntary spasm racked his massive frame. He turned his head and coughed, a wet, terrible hacking sound that tore at his throat. A thick, viscous splatter of black, necrotic blood erupted from his lips, painting the pristine stone floor with the undeniable physical evidence of his decaying magic. Through the blinding, absolute agony systematically dismantling his empire from the inside out, one chilling, impossible truth pierced the fog of his dying mind. The unbreakable, sacred bond forged by the moon goddess herself had not simply faded away. It had been murdered, and the quiet, invisible woman he had arrogantly assumed would wait in the shadows forever had just permanently erased him from her world. The suffocating, profound darkness of the forgotten temple beneath the fortress of Thornmere offered a strange, unexpected comfort as Seren Vantrell carefully bound the catastrophic wound on her right hip. She wrapped a thick, folded strip of clean linen tightly around her waist, pulling the heavy fabric taut against the freshly severed connection where the agonizing claiming brand used to reside. The heavy white cloth immediately bloomed with a stark, brilliant patch of crimson, but the potent, freezing toxin of the nightshade anesthetic paste held the worst of the physical agony firmly at bay. She had used pure silver and purifying fire to physically erase the magical mark from her skin, executing the ancient lunar ritual with a chilling, silent precision. Her hands, usually so gentle when tending to the pack's medicinal gardens, were now entirely steady. They moved with a cold, clinical detachment that had nothing at all to do with healing. The searing, toxic heat that had plagued her nervous system for 2 agonizing years was completely gone. In its place was a vast, echoing emptiness. It was a profound stillness that left her feeling dangerously light, as if gravity itself had suddenly lost its unyielding grip on her small frame. She had endured the public humiliation in complete silence, patiently waiting for the precise moment to sever the spiritual chain that bound her to a betrayer. She reached out and picked up the blooded, silver-leaf dagger from the black basalt altar. The freezing metal grounded her racing mind, a tangible reminder of the permanent choice she had just made. She left the heavy iron mortar and the remaining toxic purple paste sitting on the dark stone. It stood as a silent, permanent monument to the irreversible magic she had invoked. Turning her back on the subterranean depths, the quiet woman began the long, arduous ascent up the narrow, winding spiral staircase. Her legs trembled slightly with each upward step. This trembling did not stem from any lingering fear of discovery, but from the immense physiological shock of operating without the heavy magical anchor that had weighed her down since her mating night. With every stone stair she conquered, the oppressive, suffocating density of Draven's dominion grew weaker. It dissolved into the freezing winter air until it was nothing more than a fading memory. She did not feel sorrow. She did not feel regret. She felt only the cold, unyielding armor of complete self-preservation settling over her damaged soul. She slipped through the quiet, torch-lit corridors of the Thornmere stronghold like a phantom. Her soft shoes made no sound whatsoever against the ancient granite floors. The heavily armored guards were either changing shifts in the outer courtyards or deeply asleep in the barracks, thoroughly exhausted after the heavy indulgence of the winter solstice feast. The towering obsidian shadows of the fortress, which had always felt so hostile and intimidating to the low-status Omega, now seemed to actively conceal her small silhouette. They wrapped around her in a protective, dark embrace, shielding her from the eyes of a pack that had never truly seen her worth. She returned to the freezing royal bedchamber one last time, pushing the solid wooden barrier open with a steady, unflinching hand. The cavernous room felt entirely alien to her now. It was nothing more than a hollow, staged theatre set where she had spent 2 agonizing years playing the role of a silent, obedient ghost. She walked directly to the stone hearth, her storm-grey eyes devoid of any lingering sentimentality as she retrieved the Moonstone Alliance ring she had left on the mantel earlier that evening. The heavy silver band felt incredibly cold and entirely useless in her corlused palm. It was completely stripped of the warm spiritual resonance it was supposed to carry. Dropping the jewelry into the deep pocket of her apron, she grabbed a small, worn wooden box filled with essential medicinal herbs, dried roots, and basic survival supplies. She wrapped a thick, nondescript traveler's cloak around her shoulders, pulling the heavy dark wool tightly against the biting draft leaking through the window panes. Before leaving the chamber forever, she took a handful of cold, grey ash from the dead fireplace. She systematically rubbed it across the surface of the small wooden desk and the floorboards near the imposing wardrobe. It was a calculated, strictly necessary precaution. The fine ash completely neutralized the faint, lingering scent of dried lavender and rain that belonged to her, effectively erasing any olfactory trail the elite royal trackers might try to follow. She ensured there was nothing at all left of her presence in the room, save for the suffocating artificial stench of gardenia perfume that still clung to Draven Blackwood's folded cloak on the bed. That sweet, cloying floral scent belonged exclusively to Genevieve Vantrell, her glamorous, manipulative older sister. It was the exact same scent Seren had quietly, meticulously documented in her worn, leather-bound ledger. She had tracked every single instance of infidelity without ever shedding a visible tear, maintaining her quiet dignity while her entire world shattered internally. 66 times she had caught her sister's scent on her mate. 66 times she had swallowed the agonizing physical backlash of the fated bond. Tonight was the final, exact tally. A girl who has never been seen cannot be replaced, because she was never there to begin with. She turned away from the royal bed, stepping out into the shadowed hallway and closing the heavy oak door on her past. Leaving the residential wing entirely, the quiet runaway navigated the sprawling, labyrinthine architecture of the upper fortress until she reached the heavy iron-wrought doors of the main pack sanctuary. This was the grand, vaulted marble hall where the supreme ruler of Thornmere had formerly claimed her before the ancestors, binding their souls together in front of 10,000 cheering wolves. The towering stained-glass windows lining the high walls rattled violently against the ferocious winter blizzard raging outside. The flashing lightning cast long, distorted, multicolored shadows across the polished obsidian floor. She walked slowly down the long, empty center aisle, her footsteps echoing softly in the cavernous space. Approaching the pristine white marble of the grand altar, she paused. She looked down at the sacred stone where her devastating sentence of a loveless marriage had originally been handed down. With a steady, unhurried hand, Seren reached into her pocket and placed the heavy Moonstone Alliance ring exactly in the center of the altar. Beside the discarded jewelry, she laid the ancient silver leaf dagger. Its pure metal was still heavily coated in the dark crimson evidence of her ultimate liberation. She dipped her index finger into the wet blood pooled on the flat side of the silver blade. Without a single ounce of hesitation or trembling rage, she pressed her finger to the flawless white marble and dragged it downward. She wrote the number 66 directly onto the sacred stone. The thick crimson lines stood out, starkly against the pure white surface, a permanent, undeniable desecration of the pack's most holy monument. It was not a manic, chaotic scrawl left by a heartbroken, hysterical victim. It was a perfectly legible, meticulously drawn receipt. It was the final, exacting accounting of a spiritually bankrupt marriage, a mathematical proof of the exact cost of his towering arrogance. She stepped back from the altar, pulling the heavy hood of her dark cloak over her head to shield her face from the impending storm. As she turned toward the heavy side doors that led directly out into the unforgiving northern wilderness, she rested one colloosed hand gently against her lower abdomen, beneath the heavy layers of wool and the painful, numbed bandages, where she had physically erased the claiming mark from her skin using silver and fire. She felt a tiny, dormant spark of burning, molten gold warmth. It was a radiant, fierce light that had nothing at all to do with the severed mate bond. The elite lords of the court had openly mocked her, entirely convinced she was a barren, defective vessel who could never provide the king with a proper heir. They were devastatingly wrong. Pushing the heavy wooden doors open with her shoulder, she stepped out into the blinding, violent fury of the winter blizzard. The freezing, ferocious wind immediately swallowed her small silhouette, erasing her footprints in the deep snow before she even took her third step. She vanished, like smoke through a crack in the world, and she took the child with her. The sprawling, hostile fortress of Thornmere faded rapidly into the chaotic whiteout behind her, leaving her completely, beautifully untethered. For the first time in years, the freezing air filling her lungs did not taste of ash, betrayal, or the cloying sweetness of gardenia perfume. It tasted only of absolute, pristine freedom, a jagged, phantom blade of pure ice scraped against his subconscious mind, a terrifying physical tearing that dragged him brutally upward from the dark. The sterile, sharp scent of concentrated yarrow root and medicinal herbs was the very first sensory detail to penetrate the suffocating, pitch-black void of Draven Blackwood's unconsciousness. He dragged his heavy eyelids open, his vision entirely blurred and swimming with chaotic, frantic dark spots that stubbornly refused to settle. He was lying flat on his back on a rigid iron cot, surrounded by the blindingly bright, heavily stoked hearths of the deepest, most secure ward in the Pack Hospital. The ambient temperature of the medical room was unbearably sweltering, yet the towering sovereign shook with violent, uncontrollable, bone-rattling tremors. His naturally tanned skin had turned a sickly, ashen grey, and his entire body felt as though it had been forcefully encased in a thick, inescapable block of frost-cold glacial ice. He tried to draw a deep, stabilizing breath to clear his spinning head, but his broad lungs hitched. They were completely unable to expand to their full capacity. The very center of his chest, where the radiant, grounding golden warmth of the fated mate bond had resided safely for 2 years, was now a gaping, necrotic hollow. It physically ached with a phantom, tearing agony. It felt exactly as if a jagged piece of rusted, freezing iron had been deliberately left behind to scrape brutally against his ribs with every single heartbeat. The hollow mark didn't just contain his pain, it created a void, a total absence where his supreme magical power should be. The crushing realization of his physical decay was entirely overwhelming, a violent plunge into a sensory abyss where he could no longer feel the comforting pulse of the woman who had quietly anchored his entire kingdom. "Hold him down. Do not let him tear the bindings." A frantic, high-pitched voice shouted from somewhere near his left shoulder. It was his lead medical elder, a seasoned, battle-hardened healer who had routinely treated catastrophic war wounds without ever breaking a sweat. Right now, the old wolf sounded undeniably terrified. Draven completely ignored the desperate command. His colossal inner beast, usually a terrifying, world-ending force of unrivaled dominance, was currently curled into a pathetic, whimpering shadow inside his mind. The immense predator was completely blind and deaf, thrashing weakly and clawing at the empty, freezing void where its mate used to anchor it. The wolf was actively dying of starvation, its primary magical tether violently, permanently torn away by an ancient ritual. With a guttural, wet roar of sheer, unadulterated panic, the sovereign tore the heavy leather medical restraints from his thick wrists. The reinforced straps snapped like brittle, dry twigs under the explosive burst of his desperate, uncoordinated strength. Several elite palace guards immediately rushed forward to secure his shoulders, but he threw the heavily armored men aside with a blind, chaotic sweep of his heavy arm. He sent them crashing violently into the stone walls of the ward, not caring about the brutal impact. He did not care about his imposing military dignity. He did not care that he was clad only in ruined, blood-soaked linen trousers, his chest heaving irregularly. He had to find her, because when he felt the bond completely shatter, something in him roared that he had to see the quiet, invisible woman who was supposed to remain safely tucked away in his shadow forever. He staggered out of the medical ward, his bare feet leaving faint, bloody footprints on the freezing granite floor of the corridor. Every single step required a monumental, agonizing physical effort. His legendary speed and flawless predatory balance were completely gone. His equilibrium was entirely shattered by the sudden absence of the magical counterweight that had stabilized his immense, territorial power. He leaned heavily against the cold stone walls, practically dragging his broad frame up the grand staircases toward the residential royal wing. His breath came in shallow, ragged, desperate gasps that burned his throat. Reaching the heavy oak door of his private bedchamber, he threw it open with enough force to crack the thick wood against the inner stone wall. His silver irises were wild, dilated, and scanning the dim space with pure desperation. "Seren," he choked out, the familiar name tearing painfully at his raw, bleeding throat. The cavernous room was entirely, devastatingly empty. It was not just unoccupied. It had been systematically, meticulously scrubbed of her entire existence. The stone hearth was completely cold, filled only with dead, grey, lifeless ash. The small wooden desk tucked away in the dark corner was bare, the worn, leather-bound ledger and the writing quills completely gone. He stumbled forward, his large hands tearing open the doors of the imposing wardrobe. Only his own grand, heavily embroidered garments stared back at him in the suffocating darkness. Her few plain, rough-spun woolen dresses were entirely missing. He inhaled deeply, desperately searching the freezing air for the faint, comforting scent of dried lavender and rain that usually clung quietly to the edges of the room. There was no trace whatsoever, only the sterile, bitter smell of cold hearth ash and the lingering, sickeningly sweet stench of gardenia perfume. The distinct lack of her subtle warmth made the grand royal bedchamber feel like a meticulously prepared tomb. The artificial floral oil, which he had so arrogantly welcomed just hours ago, now smelled like rancid, rotting garbage to his decaying, frantic senses. A colossal, crushing wave of existential dread buckled his knees. He caught himself heavily on one of the thick wooden posts of the four-poster bed, his knuckles turning stark white as the wood groaned under his weight. She had not just run away in a momentary, predictable fit of emotional distress. She had planned this departure with a chilling, flawless precision. She had carefully, permanently erased herself from his domain, leaving no trail whatsoever for his elite hunters to track. His dying wolf let out a sudden, frantic, directional whine inside his skull. The fading beast had sensed a faint, residual trace of her ancient blood magic echoing up from the lower levels of the fortress. Draven hauled himself upright, his vision severely tunneling, as he forced his failing body to follow the desperate biological instinct. He stumbled blindly out of the residential wing, completely ignoring the shocked, murmuring servants and bewildered courtiers who backed away in terror from their broken king. He dragged his heavy, uncoordinated limbs through the grand corridors, moving relentlessly toward the main pack sanctuary. The freezing stone floor offered no comfort to his bare, bleeding feet, but the physical pain was a dull, insignificant echo compared to the catastrophic ruin unfolding inside his chest. He pushed his weight against the towering iron doors of the grand hall, stumbling into the vast, silent space. The moonlight sliced sharply through the stained glass windows, illuminating the long center aisle and the grand marble altar of the moon goddess at the far end of the room. He crossed the stone floor, his breathing ragged, shallow, and increasingly wet. As he approached the pristine white stone of the sacred monument, the pale moonlight caught the dull, metallic gleam of the heavy moonstone alliance ring resting precisely in the center. Draven reached out a trembling hand, but he did not touch the discarded silver band. His dilated, terrified eyes locked instantly onto the ancient silver-leaf dagger resting right beside it. The pure metal was heavily coated in dried, dark crimson blood. The metallic scent of her life force hit his nose, a devastating olfactory confirmation of the violence she had endured to escape him. The sheer reality of her physical suffering, willingly undertaken just to sever their connection, tore through his chest like a jagged blade. And then he saw the numbers. The 2 digits were painted entirely in her own blood, the thick crimson lines stark, bold, and horrifyingly permanent against the white marble surface. They were not frantically scribbled in the dark by a woman losing her mind. They were drawn with chilling, unwavering precision. It was a final, undeniable receipt left behind by a woman who had quietly tolerated the intolerable, right up until the exact devastating moment she simply refused to endure it anymore. The profound realization hit the towering Alpha King with the catastrophic force of a physical avalanche. 66, the exact, literal number of times he had returned to their shared, sacred chambers carrying the sweet, cloying scent of her older sister's perfume on his skin, his hair, and his clothes. Every single time she had washed those cloaks in silence. Every single time she had served him honeyed wine without a tremor in her hand. She had known the entire time. He had arrogantly, foolishly assumed she was entirely too weak, too magically defective, and too completely dependent on his royal protection to ever challenge his blatant infidelities. He had looked at her lowered head and mistakenly thought her silence was submission. It had not been submission. It had been a highly calculated, meticulously monitored countdown. The invincible ruler of Thornmere let out a broken, agonizing sound that did not belong to a sane man or a proud beast. It was the horrific, hollow sound of a completely shattered soul. Draven collapsed entirely, his muscular legs folding beneath him as he dropped heavily to his knees before the desecrated altar. He leaned forward and pressed his feverish forehead directly against the freezing, blood-stained white marble. His broad shoulders shook violently in the dark as the devastating, irreversible truth crushed the last arrogant remnants of his empire into dust. She was gone, and she had erased him completely. Exactly 1 year had passed since the howling winter blizzard had swallowed the quiet, invisible Luna of Thornmere, erasing her entirely from the frozen, hostile architecture of the northern mountains. The brutal, jagged ice of the Blackwood territory had been completely replaced by the rhythmic, soothing crash of the endless ocean against the dark basalt cliffs of Brindle Hollow. This remote coastal village clung stubbornly to the very edge of the continent, wrapped in a perpetual, protective blanket of dense sea mist. The heavy, salt-laden fog acted as a natural, impenetrable fortress against the prying eyes of the outside world. It smelled strongly of dried kelp, wild seagrass, and the rich, damp earth of the shoreline. It was a humble, forgotten place, entirely lacking the imposing military grandeur, the cold stone corridors, and the towering obsidian walls of the royal keep. For Seren, that absolute obscurity was the most beautiful, luxurious sanctuary in the entire world. The interior of her sturdy, wood-panelled cottage was bathed in the soft, golden light of a crackling hearth fire. It was a stark, profound contrast to the suffocating, smoke-choked blazes she used to tend for an ungrateful court. Seren Vantrell stood perfectly still by the heavy oak table, her striking pale irises completely clear of the heavy, exhaust shadows that had haunted her for 2 agonizing years. The constant, physical weight of her former mate's dominance was entirely gone. That oppressive phantom pressure that had constantly demanded her silent submission, crushing the breath from her lungs whenever he entered a room, had vanished without a single trace. Her calloused hands were still accustomed to hard labor, but the frantic, nervous tremor that used to accompany her every movement had been completely smoothed away by 12 months of absolute, undisturbed peace. Jars of crushed pearl powder, dried sea lavender, and deep-water kelp lined the heavy wooden shelves, their earthy, soothing scents mingling with the warm air. They effectively replaced the toxic nightshade and bitter yarrow of the frozen north, trading the harsh survival of the pack for genuine, restorative healing. Resting comfortably in a woven reed basket near the warm stones of the fireplace was a small, sleeping infant. The child was a tiny, radiant spark of undeniable cosmic magic, wrapped securely in soft, undyed coastal wool. Her daughter possessed a tuft of pure, luminous silver hair that seemed to catch and amplify the ambient light of the room, shining like a fallen star against the rustic fabric. It was a clear, biological testament to the ancient lunar lineage the elite lords of Thornmere had arrogantly and mockingly declared extinct. The baby breathed in a steady, incredibly peaceful rhythm, her small chest rising and falling in perfect time with the distant, rolling ocean waves. She remained completely untouched by the toxic, violent pack politics that had nearly consumed her mother's life. Here, the child would only know warmth, unconditional safety, and the unyielding protection of a mother who had bled herself dry to guarantee her survival. Sitting across from Seren at the scarred wooden table was Marta Finch. She was a practical, grey-haired neighbour whose sturdy, lined face spoke of decades spent mending heavy fishing nets and weathering harsh coastal squalls. The older woman was currently wincing, her teeth gritted tightly together as she extended her right forearm over a clean linen cloth. A severe burn stretched from her wrist to her elbow. It was the horrific result of a careless accident with a boiling cauldron of rendered whale fat earlier that morning. The wound was a dreadful expanse of damaged skin, the edges blistered and angry, radiating a searing heat that made the older woman tremble involuntarily. "It hurts like the absolute blazes, Seren," the older woman grunted, her voice tight with undeniable pain. She simply offered the raw, unpolished honesty of a true community, something Seren had never once experienced within the grand, treacherous, and politically toxic halls of her former life. "I know, Marta," the quiet healer replied, her voice a soothing, steady murmur that carried genuine, unforced warmth. "But the heat is already beginning to leave the tissue. Just breathe through the stinging for one more moment. You are doing perfectly." Seren placed her palms gently hovering an inch above the damaged, blistering flesh of her neighbor's arm. In the past, whenever she had attempted to access her dormant magical abilities, the greedy, parasitic fated mate bond had instantly siphoned the energy away. It had always left her utterly exhausted, dizzy, and entirely powerless. The hollow mark on her hip had acted as a massive, magical void, relentlessly draining her ancient lunar strength to artificially inflate Draven Blackwood's imposing aura. But that toxic tether had been permanently severed. The agonizing wound she had endured to physically cut the bond a year ago had completely healed. It left behind a smooth, pale crescent scar that looked exactly like a delicate dusting of silver stardust across her skin. It no longer burned with desperate yearning. It no longer throbbed with the sickening, cloying scent of Genevieve's gardenia perfume or the bitter, crushing agony of betrayal. It was completely, beautifully dead, without the oppressive fated bond suffocating her spirit. The supreme, unsuppressed magic of her bloodline surged to the surface with a magnificent, effortless grace. A soft, radiant golden ether began to gather around her fingertips, glowing with the gentle, restorative warmth of a rising dawn. The intricate, cosmic energy flowed smoothly from her hands, wrapping completely around Marta's burned arm like a luminous, protective bandage. The physical sensation was immediate and profound. The ether flowed like liquid honey, sinking deeply into the damaged tissue. The angry, blistering red skin began to mend itself under the golden light. The damaged surface regenerated at a miraculous, impossible speed, leaving perfect, unblemished tissue in its wake. The faint scent of ozone and sea salt filled the small room, a physical manifestation of her ancient, undeniable sovereignty. Marta let out a long, shuddering sigh of absolute relief as the searing agony vanished, entirely replaced by a soothing, deep tissue warmth. The older woman watched the magical display with wide, reverent eyes, completely unbothered by the fact that her humble neighbor possessed the power of a walking deity. "Every time you do that, child, I swear the moon goddess herself is standing right there in my kitchen," Marta whispered, gently flexing her newly healed, flawless skin. She looked up, her expression turning uncharacteristically serious and deeply troubled. "You are a profound blessing to this village, Seren. But that incredible light you carry, it makes the dark rumors from the northern merchants seem entirely too real." Seren calmly wiped her hands on a clean scrap of linen, her heart maintaining its steady, unbothered rhythm. "What rumors, Marta?" The older woman leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial, hushed tone as if afraid the very wind might overhear them. "The traveling caravans arrived at the eastern docks this morning. They say the invincible sovereign of Thornmere has completely lost his mind. He has spent the entire year searching frantically across 3 continents for a woman who simply vanished into thin air. The merchants claim his physical health is catastrophically deteriorating. His once imposing skin is supposedly covered in horrific frost burns that never heal. It is a terrifying curse born directly from a dead, rotting mate bond." Marta shivered, rubbing her arms as if the mere mention of the towering sovereign brought a phantom chill into the warm, fire-lit cottage. They say he rides his massive beast through the most violent snowstorms without a cloak, completely feral, screaming a name no one is allowed to speak. He supposedly falls to his knees in the snow, clutching his chest as if trying to rip out a phantom pain that will not stop bleeding. He is completely broken by the agonizing realization of what he threw away. His army is exhausted, his elite trackers are failing, and his inner wolf is practically a walking spectre. The entire Northern Empire is slowly crumbling into dust because the king is being eaten alive by his own broken soul. Seren listened to the grim, horrific detailing of the monarch's absolute physical decay without a single flinch. There was no sudden, panicked spike in her pulse. There was no lingering, pathetic urge to rush back across the continent to soothe the agonizing, cold, burning torment of the man who had repeatedly shattered her heart. The dead space on her hip remained perfectly, silently cold. The horrific suffering of the Alpha King was not a tragedy to her. It was simply the exact, mathematical consequence of the 66 betrayals she had meticulously documented in her secret ledger. He had arrogantly assumed he could continuously poison their sacred tether without paying the ultimate price. He was devastatingly wrong. The Northern Kings build their empires on ice and arrogance, Marta, Seren said softly, turning away to gently stroke the silver hair of her sleeping daughter. When the ice finally cracks, the foundation simply shatters into a million pieces. It has absolutely nothing to do with us. Marta nodded slowly, accepting the profound, quiet wisdom of the healer. She stood up, pulling her heavy wool shawl tightly around her shoulders to ward off the damp chill of the coast. You speak the absolute truth, Seren. We are safe here. The Lycan King patrols these borders himself. No feral, dying beast from Thornmere will ever cross the salt lines of Brindle Hollow. As the neighbor quietly let herself out into the misty afternoon, Seren remained standing by the warm hearth. The cottage was enveloped in a profound, incredibly serene silence. She had completely erased the towering, abusive shadow of her past, replacing the bitter cold of Thornmere with the radiant, golden warmth of her own sovereign magic. The absolute tranquility of the coastal sanctuary was suddenly interrupted by the sound of heavy, deliberate footsteps approaching the wooden porch. The rhythmic crunch of boots against the gravel path was entirely different from the hurried, practical steps of the local fishermen. It was the massive, measured stride of a true apex predator, carrying an immense, territorial weight that instantly commanded the physical environment. Yet, unlike the oppressive, suffocating dominance that Draven used to project to crush the air out of a room, this immense presence felt entirely contained, heavily disciplined, and profoundly protective. The thick oak door of the cottage opened gently, refusing to slam against the frame, despite the violent coastal wind trying to force its way inside. Valorin Vance stepped over the threshold, immediately ducking his broad, towering shoulders to accommodate the low, humble ceiling of the healer's home. The Lycan King of the eastern coastal territories was a magnificent, terrifying figure of absolute military authority. He was clad in dark, salt-stained leather armor and a heavy cape of deep oceanic blue, clasped at the shoulder with a silver leviathan crest. His golden eyes, sharp and endlessly observant, scanned the small room with the instinctual, protective assessment of a guardian, ensuring the perimeter was entirely secure. However, the exact moment his gaze found Seren standing quietly by the hearth, the terrifying, feral edge of the sovereign Lycan vanished completely. Valorin deliberately dimmed his overwhelming, magical aura, physically lowering his chin in a gesture of profound, unhesitating respect. He did not demand her immediate attention. He did not issue cold, administrative commands or expect her to cater to his towering ego. He simply stood near the entrance, patiently waiting to be acknowledged within her private domain. Valorin, Seren murmured, a genuine, soft smile finally gracing her features as she turned to face him. She did not feel the agonizing phantom burn of a forced mate bond when she looked at the Lycan King. Instead, she felt a deep, resonant warmth built entirely on mutual respect, transparent loyalty, and absolute safety. Seren, the powerful protector, replied, his voice a deep, resonant rumble that vibrated with genuine care. He crossed the room with surprisingly quiet, graceful steps, stopping a respectful distance from the sleeping infant. He looked down at the tiny, silver-haired girl in the woven basket, his golden eyes softening completely. The little moonbeam sleeps through the storm again. She possesses your incredible resilience. Seren gently pulled a knitted blanket higher over her daughter's shoulders, shielding her from the draft of the open door. She possesses the absolute peace of a child who has never known the cold. What brings you out in this heavy sea mist, Valorin? The border patrols rarely venture this deep into the village during the afternoon tide. The towering Lycan King's expression shifted, the gentle warmth immediately hardening into a mask of pure, lethal seriousness. He reached into the heavy leather pouch strapped to his armored thigh and withdrew a small, dark object. He placed it carefully on the edge of the oak table. It was a silver insignia clasp deeply engraved with the snarling, jagged wolf crest of the Thornmere pack. The polished metal was heavily scratched and stained with dark mud. Seren stared at the crest, her expressive features narrowing slightly, but her breathing remained completely steady. The phantom ghost of the Alpha King had finally managed to brush against the absolute boundary of her sanctuary. My outer border sentries intercepted a highly trained scout an hour before dawn, Valorin explained, his deep voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. He was a shadow tracker from the Northern Territories, heavily cloaked and moving with absolute desperation. The spy had managed to catch a very faint, residual whiff of ancient lunar magic drifting on the high winds. He was attempting to release a messenger raven back to the frozen mountains to report your exact coordinates. The terrifying reality of the situation hung heavily in the warm air of the cottage. The invincible ruler, currently rotting from the inside out and driven entirely feral by the dead bond, had sent his desperate hounds to scour the very edges of the earth. If that raven had taken flight, Draven's exhausted, massive army would have descended upon Brindle Hollow like a catastrophic avalanche of ice and violence. They would have torn the peaceful coastal village apart just to drag her back to the frozen altar. "What did you do with him?" Seren asked quietly, her voice entirely devoid of panic or trembling fear. Valorin looked directly into her eyes, his golden gaze completely unwavering and filled with an absolute, uncompromising promise of lethal protection. "I dealt with the threat personally. I ensured he could not signal for help and cast his body into the freezing ocean depths. He did not send a single word back to his decaying master. Your sanctuary remains entirely unbroken. He had sworn to shield her smallness from the world of teeth, and he had delivered on that sacred vow without a single moment of hesitation." The spy was exhausted, frostbitten, and driven completely mad by the brutal, unrelenting demands of his sovereign. Valorin continued, his tone thick with a cold, clinical disgust for the northern pack. "He wept like a broken child when my guards dragged him to the cliffs. He babbled extensively about the catastrophic state of his alpha. Draven Blackwood is practically a walking spectre, Seren. The severed bond has completely metastasized within his nervous system." Valorin paused, his golden eyes scanning her face to ensure she was comfortable hearing the brutal details before continuing. His imposing physical muscle is wasting away, leaving him a gaunt, hollow figure. His skin is suffering terrible cold burns because the magical void you left behind is constantly sucking the heat from his blood. The remaining elite lords of Thornmere are absolutely terrified of him. They whisper that the king is possessed by a suicidal madness, banishing his own generals in fits of blind, unadulterated grief. The arrogant sovereign is suffering the exact physical agony of 1,000 consequences, all because he thought a quiet woman would never wield her own strength to walk away. Seren slowly reached down, her fingertips lightly brushing against the fabric of her dress over the pale, silvery crescent scar on her hip. She felt only the smooth, unblemished texture of completely healed skin. The 66 times she had silently endured the cloying scent of Genevieve's perfume on his collar, the 66 times her soul had fractured to sustain his arrogant empire, it all felt like a distant, irrelevant nightmare that could no longer touch her waking reality. The horrific, agonizing Decay currently shredding his empire, and his physical body was not a tragic accident. It was the flawless, mathematical justice of the moon goddess. "Let him freeze in the cold," Seren said flatly. The statement was not a fiery, melodramatic curse shouted in a fit of rage. It was a chilling, absolute verdict delivered with the profound stillness of an executioner. He made his bed in the freezing ice. Now he must lie in it as his soul starves to death. Valorin nodded slowly, stepping slightly closer to place a massive, warm hand gently over hers on the wooden table. The physical contact did not spark with the violent, toxic possession of a forced mate bond. It radiated a deep, grounding, and incredibly safe warmth. "He will never step foot in this territory alive," Valorin swore, his voice vibrating with the absolute, unyielding authority of a true sovereign. "I have mobilized the entire Eastern Armada. The coastal cliffs are heavily fortified. If the Blackwood army even attempts to approach the salt line, I will personally sink every single one of his ships into the roaring tide. You belong to the peace of this ocean now, Seren. You are entirely, completely safe." Seren looked up at the towering, formidable man who had willingly placed his entire kingdom between her and the ghost of her past. He had never once demanded her magic, never mocked her quietness, and never expected her to shrink herself to accommodate his massive ego. She smiled, a profound, overwhelming sense of absolute liberation washing through her veins. Just as the tranquil certainty settled between them, a frantic, desperate commotion erupted immediately outside her sturdy front entrance. The rhythmic crash of the ocean was suddenly drowned out by the harsh, wet sound of a heavy body stumbling blindly through the gravel path, followed instantly by the sharp, warning shouts of Valorin's coastal sentries. The massive Lycan King pivoted, his golden eyes flashing with sudden, lethal violence as his hand dropped to the hilt of his blade. The thick door was suddenly thrown open from the outside, violently crashing against the interior wall. A man fell through the threshold, collapsing heavily into the freezing, salt-soaked mud directly beneath the porch awning. Seren stepped slowly toward the doorway, her storm-grey eyes narrowing as she looked down into the sleet. It was Draven Blackwood, the invincible sovereign of Thornmere, had desperately trailed the residual scent of his captured shadow tracker directly to the edges of the salt line, slipping past the outer blockade in a state of sheer suicidal madness. But the man kneeling in the freezing mud was completely unrecognizable. He was a ruined, hollow, and frost-bitten spectre of his former glory. The towering, muscular frame that had once projected absolute dominance was now terrifyingly gaunt, his regal clothes torn into mud-caked rags. His once proud face was hollowed out by absolute despair, his pale skin marred by horrific cold burns that festered endlessly without the protective warmth of a mate. "Seren," he choked out, his voice cracking into a pathetic, agonizing sob that shattered the quiet coastal air. "Seren, please." The broken sovereign dragged himself forward through the wet earth, weeping uncontrollably as he fell to his knees directly at the base of her wooden steps. The towering beast, who had once commanded 10,000 wolves with a single, icy stare, was now trembling, sobbing, and utterly reduced to nothing as he begged for her forgiveness. He reached out with a trembling, frost-blackened hand, his fingers frantically brushing against her lower arm in a desperate, starving bid for salvation. In the past, his touch would have sent a searing, toxic rush of fire burning straight through her veins, but as his cold, desperate fingers clamped around her wrist, the physical contact registered as absolutely nothing. There was no spark. There was no agonizing pull behind her ribs. There was no sickening rush of gardenia and ice. Her completely healed, unmarked skin remained perfectly silent, proving the ancient fated bond was permanently and completely erased. He was just a dying stranger clinging to a ghost. Before the desperate Alpha could attempt to pull her closer, Seren Vantrell stepped smoothly between them. The Lycan King did not shout or bare his teeth. He simply placed his massive armor-clad frame directly in front of Seren, physically shielding her from the rotting spectre of her past. He swatted Draven's freezing hand away with absolute, chilling disgust. "Do not touch what does not belong to you, Broken King," Seren growled, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that promised immediate consequences. Draven ignored the towering Lycan, his desperate, bloodshot eyes remaining entirely locked on Seren's calm, undisturbed face. "I was wrong," he wept, his broad shoulders shaking violently in the freezing mud. "I was so devastatingly wrong. Please, I will give you everything. I will burn the entire keep to the ground. Just come back to me, the cold. The cold is eating me alive." Seren looked down at the weeping, shattered man who had systematically destroyed her heart 66 times. She felt no pity, no lingering warmth, and no desire to heal the rotting wasteland of his soul. Her quiet, observant strength remained perfectly contained in chilling, silent precision. "I do not accept your apologies, Draven," she stated flatly, her voice entirely devoid of the trembling fear she had once harbored. "I am not your healer, and I am not your mate. I severed our bond entirely. My magic belongs to the sun and the sea now, and you belong entirely to the ice." She stepped back, safely behind the towering, unyielding protection of Seren. "Thank you for letting me go," she thought with profound stillness, because being let go had allowed her to be found by a better man, a better kingdom, a better life, and she would never, ever look back. The broken, decaying Alpha King of Thornmere could spend the rest of his miserable, frost-bitten existence screaming her name into the endless winter storms. He could crawl on his knees across the entire continent, begging the empty wind for a single ounce of her ancient, glowing warmth. But the quiet, invisible woman he had so arrogantly discarded was completely gone. She had unstitched her soul from his rotting empire, erased his absolute authority from her life, and rebuilt herself into a sovereign goddess of the sun and sea. She stood entirely untouchable behind the impenetrable shield of a Lycan king who knew exactly what she was worth. But the rotting, frost-bitten spectre of the northern mountains simply refused to accept the absolute finality of his execution. As Serin's heavy, armored sentries moved forward to forcefully drag the decaying intruder back into the roaring coastal storm, Draven Blackwood violently thrashed in the freezing mud. It was not the proud, terrifying resistance of an invincible warlord. It was the frantic, uncoordinated, and utterly pathetic flailing of a starving beast making one final, desperate bid for survival. His ruined hands clawed desperately at the salt-soaked earth, his numbed fingers scraping against the jagged gravel as he fought to anchor himself to the very ground she walked upon. His imposing, muscular frame, which had once cast a long, terrifying shadow that commanded the absolute submission of 10,000 wolves, was now nothing more than a hollow, fragile shell of fading tissue and shattered pride. The horrific cold burns that marred his ashen skin were not simply environmental wounds. They were the visceral, biological manifestation of a massive magical void. Every single time his heart beat, the empty, dead space in his chest actively sucked the ambient heat directly from his own marrow, slowly freezing him from the inside out. His storm-grey eyes, once pools of sharp, unyielding authority, were entirely bloodshot, leaking frozen tears that crystallized instantly against his gaunt, hollowed cheeks. He fought against the heavy grip of the Lycan guards, his voice cracking into a raw, guttural shriek that completely lacked the resonant, terrifying bass of an alpha's command. "No, you cannot take me away from her. You cannot banish me to the ice." Draven screamed, his throat tearing with the immense physical effort. He coughed violently onto the pristine white gravel, a sickening testament to the catastrophic internal rot consuming his organs. "Seren, please, you have to listen to me. The fortress is entirely gone. The Empire is turning to ash and frost. They all left me." The frantic, hysterical confession spilled from his chapped lips like a torrent of toxic venom, a desperate attempt to weaponize his own self-inflicted misery to extract a single drop of her pity. He babbled wildly, the words stumbling over each other in a chaotic, broken rhythm. He recounted the absolute devastation that had struck Thornmere in the exact moment the fated bond had been violently severed. He spoke of how the ancient, protective hearths had instantly frozen solid, refusing to light no matter how much timber was burned. He described the terrifying, sudden collapse of his military hierarchy, how his most loyal generals had looked at his decaying, wolfless state and immediately abandoned their posts in pure terror, and, with a pathetic, agonizing sob that shook his entire fragile frame, he confessed the ultimate humiliation regarding the woman he had chosen over his true mate, Genevieve. Genevieve fled the very first night the frost crept into the royal bedchamber. Draven wept, his broad, bony shoulders heaving uncontrollably as he pressed his face into the freezing mud. The moment my power began to drain, the moment the gold left my eyes, she took the royal treasury and vanished into the eastern trading ports. She never loved me. She only loved the crown you wore, so quietly. It was a curse, Seren. The gardenia perfume, the late nights. It was a toxic, blinding curse of my own immense arrogance. I traded a goddess of the sun for a parasite, and now the ice is eating me alive. He slammed his frost-blackened fists against the freezing earth, a gesture of profound, unadulterated self-loathing. The towering beast who had once demanded absolute perfection from every single servant in his grand hall was now publicly, violently dismantling his own ego in the dirt. He begged not for his kingdom, not for his military supremacy, and not even for his life. He begged for the one thing his biological instincts demanded above all else, the restorative glowing warmth of his fated mate. "Just one touch," he pleaded, his voice dropping to a hoarse, agonizing whisper as he strained against the heavy iron grip of Valorin's sentries. He looked up at the warm golden light spilling from the open doorway of the cottage, treating it like the absolute gates of heaven he had been permanently locked out of. "Just one single drop of your magic, Seren. Please, my wolf is dying. He is screaming in the dark, and I cannot breathe. I will surrender my entire territory. I will kneel at your feet for the rest of my miserable life. I will let this Lycan king strip my titles and chain me like a common dog in his courtyard. Just do not let me freeze to death in this hollow void." Seren stood perfectly still on the wooden porch, the heavy coastal wind whipping her long, dark hair around her serene, completely undisturbed face. She listened to the agonizing, visceral destruction of the man who had systematically destroyed her heart 66 times. In the past, the mere sound of his voice, raising in frustration, would have sent a sharp, panicked tremor straight down her spine. A single harsh look from his storm-grey eyes would have made her retreat into the darkest corners of the fortress, desperately folding his laundry to make herself as invisible and unproblematic as possible. But now, his frantic screams registered as absolutely nothing more than the meaningless, chaotic noise of the winter storm. She did not feel a single ounce of righteous, fiery vindication. She did not feel the sudden wild urge to laugh at his catastrophic downfall. She felt only a profound, oceanic stillness. His agonizing, cold-burning torment was not a tragedy to her. It was simply the exact, mathematical consequence of the ledger she had meticulously kept. He had arrogantly assumed he could continuously poison their sacred tether, burying her quiet devotion under the suffocating, cloying scent of Genevieve's perfume, without ever paying the ultimate price. He had believed that because she did not throw heavy goblets or scream in jealous rage, her silence was a permanent, unbreakable submission. She was not the author of his suffering. She was merely the mirror reflecting his own toxic choices back onto his rotting soul. Seren Vantrell, the towering protector, did not draw his massive silver blade. He did not need a weapon to establish his absolute superiority over the decaying spectre of Thornmere. He simply stepped forward, his heavy, armor-clad boots crunching loudly against the gravel. The immense, territorial aura of the sovereign lichen flared into the freezing mist, pressing down on Draven's fragile, broken form with the physical weight of a crashing tidal wave. The ambient temperature around Seren seemed to rise, a protective, lethal warmth that immediately neutralized the bitter, necrotic cold radiating from the fallen alpha. "Your wolf is not dying, Blackwood," Seren growled, his deep, resonant voice vibrating with absolute, clinical disgust. The Lichen King looked down at the weeping man with the cold detachment of a sovereign inspecting a diseased carcass. "Your wolf is already dead. It died the exact moment you allowed your towering arrogance to blind you to the supreme, ancient magic sitting quietly in your own shadows. You are mourning a ghost, and you are polluting the sacred, clean air of my territory with your pathetic delusions." Seren raised a heavy, gauntleted hand, signaling to his elite sentries. "Drag him to the cliffs, throw him onto whatever rotting vessel brought him here, and cast it out into the deep currents. If he attempts to crawl back onto this beach, execute him." The heavy armored guards immediately hauled Draven upward by his armpits, their grip unyielding and absolute. The broken Alpha King screamed, his legs kicking frantically in the air as his frostbitten boots lost contact with the earth. He thrashed with the last, desperate reserves of his fading adrenaline, his bloodshot eyes remaining frantically locked on the quiet woman standing in the warm light of the porch. "Seren, no. Tell him to stop. You cannot let it end like this. You are my mate. The moon goddess bound our souls together. You cannot simply erase what the ancestors forged." Seren, his hysterical, completely delusional demands echoed violently against the dark basalt's cliffs, a pathetic refusal to accept the absolute reality of his own actions. He still clung to the arrogant belief that the sacred biological laws of the pack hierarchy would magically override her personal agency. He truly believed that a fated bond, no matter how deeply corrupted, poisoned, and abused, was an unbreakable chain that would eventually force her back into his arms. Seren realized that mere words would never penetrate the thick, delusional armor of his sovereign entitlement. He needed to see the absolute, irrefutable biological truth. He needed to witness the physical monument of his complete erasure. "Wait, Seren," Seren commanded softly. Her voice was not loud. It was a smooth, steady murmur, entirely devoid of any trembling rage or dramatic flair, yet the sheer, unsuppressed sovereignty of her ancient lunar lineage carried the quiet words directly through the howling coastal wind, cutting through the chaotic noise of the storm with effortless, divine authority. The towering Lichen King immediately raised his hand, halting his heavily armored sentries in their tracks. He stepped aside gracefully, his golden eyes filled with profound, unwavering respect as he yielded the floor entirely to her. Seren stepped slowly off the wooden porch. The heavy, salt-laden mist seemed to physically part around her small silhouette, retreating respectfully from the radiant golden ether that began to softly illuminate her skin. The brutal, freezing sleet that was actively stinging Draven's frostbitten face did not dare touch her. The snowflakes simply melted into warm, glowing droplets the exact moment they entered her atmospheric perimeter. She walked directly toward the broken, weeping man, her piercing stare maintaining a chilling, absolute stillness that terrified him far more than any display of violent rage. Draven's frantic struggles ceased entirely. He hung suspended in the grip of the Lichen guards, his chest heaving violently, his dilated eyes tracking her every movement with a desperate, starving hope. He truly, foolishly believed that her approach signaled a last-minute reprieve. He thought she was coming to press her warm, healing hands against his cold burns, to resurrect the dead bond with a single forgiving touch of her supreme magic. "You speak of the moon goddess, Draven," Seren stated flatly, stopping just 3 feet away from his decaying form. "You speak of ancient bonds and sacred tethers, as if you did not spend 2 agonizing years meticulously poisoning the very root of our connection with the cloying, artificial stench of my sister's perfume. You relied on the absolute, biological law of the fated mate bond to keep me chained to a freezing throne while you warmed your bed with a parasite." She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The quiet, devastating truth of her words struck him like a barrage of heavy physical blows. "But you fundamentally misunderstood the nature of lunar magic," she continued, her voice echoing with the ancient, terrifying weight of her dormant matriarchal bloodline. "A bond is a living, breathing entity. It requires nourishment. It requires truth. When it is systematically starved, when it is subjected to 60 undeniably calculated acts of betrayal, it does not simply wait in the dark to be claimed again. It rots, and when a limb begins to rot, you do not beg for it to heal, you amputate it." Draven's ashen face twisted in genuine horrified confusion. "No, no, it cannot be amputated. The claiming mark is eternal. It is carved into your spirit. It is." Seren calmly reached down and grasped the heavy, woolen fabric of her coastal dress. With a steady, unflinching motion, she lifted the material, exposing her right hip to the biting winter wind and the terrified, staring eyes of the broken sovereign. There was no raised, angry crescent brand glowing with a toxic, feverish red light. There was no pulsing, localized heat indicating a damaged but surviving tether. The physical anchor of the fated mate bond was entirely, spectacularly gone. In its place was a smooth, incredibly pale crescent scar. It looked exactly like a delicate, flawless dusting of silver stardust embedded directly into her skin. It was completely flat, entirely unblemished, and radiated absolutely nothing. The biological void was profound, visually confirming the total, absolute destruction of their spiritual connection. The realization hit Draven Blackwood with a catastrophic, world-ending force. His dilated, bloodshot eyes locked onto the silver scar, his mind desperately trying to process the impossible, horrifying visual evidence. The ancient, agonizing ritual of lunar severing was considered a myth, a forbidden practice lost to the dark ages of the Pack Wars. Yet here was the absolute, undeniable proof. She had not simply run away to hide. She had invoked the ancient severing magic with silver and fire, permanently and irrevocably erasing him from her very soul. "Look at it, Draven," Seren demanded softly, her voice carrying the chilling, absolute finality of a closing tomb. "Look at the exact mathematical result of your towering arrogance. The hollow mark doesn't just contain your power, it creates a void, an absence where your magic should be. I did not leave you, I erased you." The last remaining fragment of Draven's sanity instantly shattered. A horrific, hollow wail erupted from deep within his necrotic chest, a sound so entirely devoid of hope or humanity that even the battle-hardened lichen sentries involuntarily tightened their grip on his arms in sheer disgust. It was the sound of a god realizing he had been permanently reduced to a mortal insect. He thrashed wildly, trying to reach out to touch the silver scar, desperately attempting to claw his way back into a spiritual sanctuary that no longer existed. "No, no, no, no! Put it back!" he shrieked, his mind completely fracturing under the immense psychological trauma. "You cannot be erased. I am the Alpha King. I command you. Put the bond back. Burn me. Let it burn." He was weeping uncontrollably, thick tears freezing instantly on his gaunt, rotting face as his entire universe collapsed into absolute, inescapable nothingness. He had finally, undeniably understood that no amount of groveling, no amount of offered territory, and no amount of physical agony would ever repair the damage. He was permanently locked out of her warmth, condemned to freeze to death in a cold, lonely void of his own making. Seren dropped the heavy fabric of her dress, smoothly covering the silver scar and instantly cutting off his view of the divine magic. She looked at his weeping, thrashing form, feeling only a profound, oceanic sense of closure. The heavy, dark chapter of her life that had begun on the altar of the old territory was now officially, permanently shut. "I am Seren of the ancient lunar line, sovereign healer of the coastal tides," Seren declared, her voice resonating with absolute, unyielding power. "And you, Draven Blackwood, are nothing but a fading, rotting note in my story. Throw him to the sea, Valorin." The towering Lycan King did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. "Remove this filth from my sight," Valorin ordered sharply. The heavy, armored sentries hauled the screaming, weeping spectre of the fallen ruler backward, dragging his thrashing form through the wet gravel and out into the violent, crashing surf. Draven's pathetic, hysterical cries of "Seren" grew fainter and fainter, instantly swallowed by the overwhelming rhythmic roar of the endless ocean. He was dragged away into the dark, freezing mist, permanently banished to the desolate, icy wasteland he had so arrogantly created for himself. Seren did not watch him disappear into the fog. She did not linger on the cold, wind-swept porch to mourn the catastrophic ruin of the man who had once been her entire world. She turned her back completely on the violence, the cold, and the toxic history of the northern mountains, her storm-grey eyes crystal clear and focused solely on the present. She stepped back over the threshold of her sturdy, wood-panelled cottage, pushing the thick timber portal firmly shut against the biting winter draught. The thick iron latch fell into place with a satisfying, absolute click. The violent, chaotic noise of the coastal storm was immediately muted, replaced entirely by the soft, comforting crackle of the golden hearth fire and the faint, sweet scent of dried sea lavender. Valorin Vance followed her inside, quietly shedding his heavy, salt-stained leather cape. The massive, terrifying Lycan King moved with an incredible, deliberate gentleness within the small confines of her sanctuary. He walked over to the woven reed basket, his imposing, muscular frame kneeling softly on the wooden floorboards as he looked down at the sleeping silver-haired infant. The tiny child stirred slightly in her sleep, completely undisturbed by the catastrophic events that had just unfolded outside her quiet world. Seren walked to the heavy wooden table, her calloused hands resting lightly against the smooth grain of the wood. The phantom weight of her past was entirely gone, completely replaced by the undeniable, radiant reality of her present sovereign freedom. She had survived the devastating physical toll of a corrupted, fated bond. She had endured the crushing, invisible stress of public humiliation and isolation in absolute silence. And she had ultimately awakened her dormant, supreme cosmic magic to completely dismantle the toxic authority of the abusers, who had dared to underestimate her quiet strength. Valorin looked up from the sleeping child, his sharp golden eyes meeting her steady, tranquil stare. There was no forced biological urgency in his look. There was no oppressive, possessive dominance demanding her immediate submission. There was only absolute, unconditional respect and a deep, resonant promise of shared, equal sovereignty. "The border is permanently secure," Valorin murmured softly, his deep voice vibrating with genuine, protective warmth. "The ice will never touch this house again." Seren smiled, a true, radiant expression that illuminated the small, warm cottage with the absolute, undeniable light of a rising sun. She walked toward the hearth, embracing the quiet, domestic peace that she had bled herself dry to secure. The elite lords of the world could continue to build their massive, imposing empires on arrogance and violence, completely unaware that true, world-bending power resided in the quiet, observant resilience of the outcast. "We are small things in a world of teeth, my Seren. Smallness is a gift. Use it." Her grandmother's voice echoed with absolute peace. because the biggest forces could only break the world with their teeth and their cold, unforgiving ambition. It was the small, silent acts of courage, the quiet refusal to be erased, and the warm, unyielding embrace of chosen love that ultimately mended it. She had walked out of a freezing, toxic prison with absolutely nothing but a small box of herbs and a secret, dormant spark of golden fire. Instead, she had found her way home,